I know you need to be away.
Oh, yeah,
It's not a problem. What we'll do, subject to anyone being uncomfortable, we'll start at 10 and we'll press through.
Yeah,
I think
perfect.
I can do it by 11:15.
Okay, brilliant.
And just so you know, at the end of my question,
being held.
just so that you all know, the stenographers are struggling to get online, recognising the time constraints.
Please could I ask you to ensure that all mobile telephones and other personal electronic devices are either switched off or in silent mode. Please may I also draw your attention to the fact that the Chair of the Inquiry, the Right Honourable Sir Justice Haddon-Cave, has made a restriction order in relation to the conduct of those who are attending this and future hearings. The full order is displayed on the inquiry website and on the door of this court and of the media annex, but I will summarise its purpose. The order, which applies to this and to all future hearings of the inquiry, prohibits any person from making an audio or video recording of inquiry proceedings from within the hearing rooms without the express permission of the chair. Furthermore, no person may take a photograph in any room in which the inquiry proceedings are taking place and at a time the inquiry is sitting, without the express permission of the chair. For the avoidance of doubt, both of these prohibitions extend to the hearing in the media annex. A further part of the order arises as the live stream of these inquiry proceedings via YouTube will purposely be subject to a 10-minute delay. It is prohibited that any person may disclose, publish or broadcast in any form or by any means anything that is said or done in the inquiry hearing room until 10 minutes after it has taken place. If an application is made for a restriction order in relation to anything that has been said or done in the inquiry hearing room in the preceding 10 minutes, anything that was said or done during the period is subject to a restriction order prohibiting its disclosure, repetition or duplication until the chair has finally determined the application. All of the above orders are subject to a penal notice. This means that any breach of any element of the restriction orders may be certified to the High Court or the Court of Session, who will have the power to fine or imprison anyone found to have been in breach of the order. Court rise. This is an open hearing in Court 73 at the Royal Courts of Justice as part of the independent inquiry relating to Afghanistan, The hearing is before Lord Justice Haddon-Cave, the chair of the inquiry.
Good morning, everybody. Admiral, would you like to resume your position? Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Glasgow.
Please you, sir. Before embarking on the concluding parts of Admiral Radakin's evidence, can I just give an indication as to timetable this morning?
Yes.
In order to accommodate everyone's availability, what I've proposed to do, and I've discussed it with everyone who represents the core participants, is that we'll endeavour to conclude Admiral Radakin's evidence in one sitting. So rather than breaking either just before or at 11 o'clock, what we'll do is press on in the hope that we can conclude his evidence before 11:30. That will see a conclusion of the evidence for today, but I can deal with what lies ahead after Admiral Radakin's evidence has been concluded.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that convenient to everybody? Good. Good. Thank you.
Admiral, can I take you straight away back to your witness statement? And what I'd like to do is to change subjects and to turn to consider compound clearance and the procedures that were in place for the clearance of compounds in Afghanistan. To help you, I'm going to invite you to look in your statement at paragraph 209 onwards.
Yes.
And given what you had told us yesterday about the training and the procedures that were put in place both before deployment and also during deployment, it perhaps will come as no surprise for anyone to learn that the Army had developed guidance on how to clear compounds and buildings during the course of Operation Herrick.
That's correct, yes.
And compounds were classified as vulnerable areas, is that right?
Yes.
And perhaps it's obvious, but the reason why you would classify a compound as a vulnerable area is what precisely, please?
Well, the principal reasons were that the reason why people would go into compounds were to collect intelligence and information. That might be because the compound was thought to be involving arms and munitions. And also it could be an area that had a requirement to assist with the gaining of popular support. And there are also more aggressive reasons where offensive operations might be required for a compound, or simpler reasons such as search or for arrest and detention. All of those give rise to the compounds being classified as a vulnerable area and requiring a particular reason for coalition forces to go into that area, and that's why these particular tactics and procedures were developed.
And presumably the classification of vulnerability applies not only to the coalition forces who are entering the compounds and therefore putting their lives at risk, but also the fact that there may be others within the compound who are not part of the insurgency who are therefore at risk.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, can I take you back just very briefly to one of the documents that we'd looked at yesterday, and that, if you wouldn't mind, is to exhibit AR26. And you may recall that when I'd asked you about the counterinsurgency operation, I'd taken you to the British Field Army Manual on counterinsurgency. And if we go to the third slide, you may recall that I'd identified, if we go one slide further on, please, thank you very much, my fault, thank you. If we look at the second area that's highlighted there, I took it to you yesterday, but to remind everyone, areas that require careful consideration and explicit policy and training include the use of force and the conduct of search operations, detention and questioning. No matter what the circumstances, expediency is not an excuse to operate outside the law. So clearly recognised by the Army and specifically set out within the publication that deals with counterinsurgency, there is a recognition that the search operations, and in particular those that might result in detention and questioning, have to be given particular care, and it's important that there is both training and guidance in place as to how those are conducted.
Yes, that's correct.
And doubtless that feeds back into the importance that those compounds are themselves classified as vulnerable areas.
Yes, and that also then feeds into if a commander was planning to go into a vulnerable area, that required an operationally legitimate reason to do so.
And you've just touched on those reasons, but just reminding everyone of what they were. The principal reasons that would allow an operationally valid entry into a compound: the collection of intelligence or information,
Yes,
the exploitation of arms and munitions,
yes,
the gaining and maintaining of popular support,
yes,
offensive operations, and then search operations or arrest and detention.
that's right.
Now, there are a number of different sets of guidelines that exist that assist in the conduct of compound clearances, and you've touched upon them in your statement, but what I'd like to do is to just deal in particular with your paragraphs 211 onwards. I'd like to consider, with your help, the methods of entry that were used to get into different compounds, and then the categorization of parts of the compound itself, and whether there are different approaches taken to the different types of compound.
Right.
Now, first of all, in terms of the method of entry used by troops, did that depend upon the assessment that had been made of the threat that might be posed by either the compound or those within it, and also the task or ground that was going to prevail, and then the available partner force that might be present?
That's correct, yes.
So it's a holistic assessment of the compound, both physically, the threat that it might pose from any possible traps within it or those who are within it, and also the available force that might be there to assist the entry.
Yes, and as well as that, the particular mission that the coalition forces were on in terms of going into that compound.
Feeding back into those operationally legitimate reasons, such as the collection of intelligence, the exploitation of arms, or the conducting of search, detention and arrest operations?
Yes.
Okay. Now then, can you help us with the recognised methods of entry that there were for gaining entry into a compound?
Yes, so the first method is what was deemed a call-out, where the use of an interpreter is used to negotiate entry. There is an ANDSF-led entry, and also an existing entry, which utilises doorways that are the obvious way to head in. And then there is, I should say, as part of the existing entry, that could include previous entry points that have been made by explosives or sites where walls were in disrepair. And then there was the use of ladders to climb over compound walls, or an explosive entry where clearly a hole is made for people to go through.
And of course, the decision that is taken as to which method of entry to use depends on the assessment of the threat, the mission, the task, the ground, and the available partner force.
Yes.
And just thinking back to where we were a moment ago, that one of the reasons for classifying compounds as a vulnerable area is the possibility that there might be people within inside it who are not part of the insurgency, and then the risk that they are exposed to. Can I take you back for a moment to where we were on the screen, to AR26? And can we turn on, please, one slide? And if we scroll down the page, perhaps so obvious it doesn't need rehearsing, but it is important nonetheless that what was made clear by Article 3 to the Geneva Convention is the requirement that persons taking no part in hostilities shall in all circumstances be treated humanely.
Yes.
So a distinction being drawn between the insurgent and the non-insurgent, if I can use those two terms.
Yes, absolutely.
Can we just scroll on perhaps two more slides to look at the fundamental principles of the law of armed conflict? And again, well known by you, but nonetheless important. And this is part of the training that all members of the armed forces receive, no matter whether they're conventional forces or special forces.
Yes.
And we see here that the 4 fundamental principles of the law of armed conflict are set out, and they are military necessity, humanity, distinction, and proportionality.
That's correct.
And just looking at them very briefly, military necessity permits a state engaged in an armed conflict to use only that degree and kind of force not otherwise prohibited by the law of armed conflict, which is required in order to achieve the legitimate purpose.
Yes.
Humanity forbids the infliction of suffering, injury, or destruction not actually necessary for the accomplishment of the legitimate military purpose.
Yes.
And then distinction requires that there is a marked difference between the treatment of combatants and non-combatants.
Yes.
And then the 4th of those fundamental principles, proportionality. Proportionality requires that the unavoidable losses, such as incidental civilian casualties and collateral damage to civilian properties resulting from military action, should not be excessive.
That's correct.
And doubtless those are the principles that anyone considering entry into a compound would have borne in mind when they made a decision, for example, about the method of entry that was being used.
Absolutely.
Insofar as there was a means of identifying different buildings that made up a compound clearance, and it was touched upon by me when I addressed the chair in opening the inquiry, we know that on some of the slides that were available and in some of the information provided, that compounds and the buildings have been designated either green or red. And in fact, there are 2 types of green and only the 1 type of red. And what I'd like to do is to ask your help with those 3 categories and whether there are any differences in approach that are taken when securing entry to them. First, if I'm correct, I think the first classification of green concerns occupied buildings. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And presumably occupied because they're understood to be occupied by local nationals, and that's been established by a pattern of life that's been observed.
And that essentially, the pattern of life is deeming that it's assessed as normal in terms of the expectation of what is going on in that compound.
And insofar as any search is conducted of those compounds, should that be done with the acquiescence and assistance of the compound elder?
Yes, ideally.
And presumably, as we'll see in a moment, the acquiescence and assistance of the compound elder meant that he, in all likelihood, would be encouraged to give assistance in a tour of the compound.
That's correct.
And when a tour of a compound was conducted, would that be led by the coalition forces or by the partner forces?
Ideally, with the partner forces in the lead.
Is that to ensure that both language and cultural propriety is observed throughout?
Yes.
Insofar as there is a phased approach to the conduct that goes on, can you help us, please, with the clearance of what would be termed a green occupied building or compound?
Yes, there are 6 phases to go through.
The first phase is that to isolate the compound.
Yes.
Can you explain to us what that means, please, Admiral?
Yes, so this involved an evaluation of the surrounding area to identify any potential threats. Isolating the compound also gave commanders time and space to consider the most appropriate method to gain entry to the compound and the level of protection required. So that was the first stage.
So that, in effect, involves an assessment of what lies ahead of you before you even make entry to the compound.
Yes.
Could you please help us with the second phase, which is termed positioning?
Yes, so this is where troops will be moved into positions around the compound in order to provide protection to the team that was then going to enter the compound.
And again, that presumably is done before entry is made in any of the ways you've set out.
Yes.
In terms of the start of any entry phase, do we then turn to the third phase known as the call-out?
Yes. And this ideally was to be led by the ANDSF wherever possible, or conducted by using an interpreter. And troops conducting the clearance were to consider whether they should ask males inside the compound to lift their clothing in order to check for concealed weapons. At this stage of a clearance, if the compound was found to be unoccupied, commanders were to consider the tactical gain from entering the compound at all, given the risk of victim-operated IEDs.
And just reminding ourselves of what you mean when you use the phrase victim-operated IEDs, those are IEDs where the circuit is closed by some sort of trigger that's activated by the victim either stepping on it or making contact with it.
Yes.
So in a sense, a booby trap that's been left in an unoccupied building.
Yes, and the person, the victim, then closes the circuit, which allows the explosion to happen.
As to the remaining three phases, next, the fourth phase, do we have the separation as it's termed?
Yes.
And what is that, please, Admiral?
So this is where all male local nationals who had exited the compound were to be separated from the women and children to facilitate searching.
And then dealing with the next phase, which concerns the material and personal exploitation as it's described, that was what, please, Admiral?
So that's called material and personnel exploitation. And this means males were to be searched first, followed by other occupants. Females were to be searched by a female patrol member under the supervision of a compound elder and in a separate room.
In the event that there wasn't a female patrol member present, was serious consideration given as to whether or not it would be appropriate even to search any of the female occupants?
That's right. If it was deemed essential, then a search was only to be conducted by a metal detector in those circumstances.
So a recognition of the cultural propriety of searching a female?
Yes.
And that was one of the principles that had been adopted by General McChrystal following discussions with President Hamid Karzai as to how these searches should be conducted.
That's right.
Insofar as there was any information to be gleaned by the search, can you help us with that, please, Admiral?
So following the searches, personnel were to conduct biometric data collection with the consent of the local nationals. If an occupant declined to consent, this could be overruled for operational reasons, such as force protection or a suspicion of insurgent group membership.
Right, so before any biometric data would be collected, consent for that collection would be sought.
Ideally.
If consent was not given, then consideration would be given as to whether it was appropriate to overrule that, either because of force protection or insurgent group membership reasons.
Yes.
And then lastly, the clearance phase itself, so the sixth of the six phases. What was that, please?
So this was when entering a compound that was clearly a residence for a family group. Commanders had to exercise discretion. Troops were encouraged to work with the compound elder and to show respect for local nationals' personal belongings.
And you've obviously taken us through those details from your statement, but insofar as that was available for everyone to understand, to learn and to put into effect, did the Operational Training and Advisory Group produce an aid memoir on compound clearance?
Yes.
We've got it as your exhibit AR30. Can we just bring up the front page, please, for a moment so we can see that we're concerned with the compound clearance aid memoir produced by OPTAG. If we look very briefly onto the next page, I'm not going to take you through the entire document, but we'll see here where I've just asked you questions about green occupied, so a compound that's occupied by local nationals, identifying the two things that you'd said at the outset. In the short term, the compound should be cleared with the acquiescence and assistance of the compound elder, who should be encouraged to give a guided tour of the compound, and that the Afghan National Security Force partners should be utilised to conduct this activity wherever possible.
Yes, and this is part of the conversation we had yesterday about the training that takes place and the operation entirety about ensuring that the British Army was best organised and trained and equipped for the tasks that it had in Afghanistan.
And presumably not only best trained and equipped for the task, but also able to recognise vulnerabilities if there were any, and culturally appropriate behaviour where necessary.
Yes.
And this, as you told us, is a process of organic development with feedback from the different rotations, so that OPTAG can continually evolve the training so that the Army gets better at what it does.
Yes.
Can we leave the green occupied for a moment, and can we go to the next type of compound, which is termed green unoccupied? And it may be obvious what is meant by an unoccupied compound, but were those identified because there was no discernible presence either of insurgents or local nationals within them?
That's correct.
Now, it may be that some people think that an empty building poses no risk, but in the context of Afghanistan and the searching of compounds, is it in fact the opposite here?
Yes. So these presented a higher risk, particularly of victim-operated IEDs, and if the situation allowed, entry into such compounds would be supported by conduct of a deliberate operation to find those IEDs and to deal with them first of all.
So rather than coming across an empty building and thinking there's nothing untoward and it doesn't matter, it's the very reverse. You have to be overcautious when it comes to an empty building because of the risks it might pose to you or to anyone else with you.
Yes.
Now, in terms of a clearance phase, if there was to be one of an unoccupied green building, can you help us with those, please, Admiral?
Yes. So in a green unoccupied compound, there were 5 phases. The first was to secure the surrounding area by deploying an outer cordon to ensure that no external insurgent threats could interfere with the clearance. The second was to isolate the compound with a particular focus on ensuring no command wire IEDs could have any effect. The third phase was to clear a safe lane up to the entry point using established counter-IED tactics. Then the fourth phase was the clearance of the entry point itself to ensure there was a safe route in and out of the compound. And then that led to the fifth phase, which was the clearance of the compound itself.
So of the 5 phases you've just identified, we can see that the first 4 are clearly identified to ensure that there is at least a minimal risk of IED before anyone enters the empty building.
Yes.
And obviously what you told us yesterday is that the insurgency was developing its use of IEDs. They were becoming harder to find and to detect. And indeed, one of the things that had been noted was that there was less metal being used in the IEDs, making them much harder to find.
Yes, and as we discussed, from 2009 onwards, they have become more prolific in their use.
Of course, I won't take you to them again, but we know the figures that you told us, the just over 400 deaths over an 8-year period, which is the equivalent of just over a death a week of a British serviceman or woman.
That's correct.
Can we then turn to deal with the third of the 3 types of compound building, those which were designated red? And was the reason for a building being designated red either because it was a building from which troops had been fired upon, or because it was believed it might pose an immediate threat from insurgents to the coalition forces?
That's correct.
Now, again, was there a phased approach to the entry of a building that had been designated as red?
Yes, in these circumstances, there were 7 phases, and the first was called the investment. This was achieved through the insertion of a fire support group in a position selected by the commander to provide tactical advantage, to provide observation and associated information whilst the troops going on to clear the compound moved to their positions.
The second phase was the compound entry. And how might that be achieved, please?
So the compound entry describes any of the entry methods that we've described as part of the green, either occupied or unoccupied ways of entering a compound.
And just to remind everyone, I won't take you back to it, but they were call out, the ANDSF-led entry, an existing entry, which is through a doorway or any other entry point that might have been made by a previous breach, the use of ladders, or the last, an explosive entry.
Yes.
Once entry had been effected, did you then turn to the third of the phases, which was the initial clearance?
Yes.
And
So
how would that be conducted, please?
the personnel would make entry through the breach or entry point and attempt immediately to neutralise any threats inside the compound in accordance with their rules of engagement.
As to the clearance itself, how was that conducted, please? That's phase 4, I believe.
So this was conducted in a sequence starting with the nearest room or building.
And in effect, does it mean working room to room in a progressive approach?
Yes.
As to the 5th phase, which is the compound secure declaration, at what point would the compound be declared as secure?
So this could not occur until all rooms, buildings, walls, ceilings and floors have been physically cleared of both IEDs and insurgents.
And in terms of a physical clearance for IEDs and insurgents, it may be obvious what a physical clearance for insurgents means, but as far as a physical clearance when it comes to IEDs, does that mean something more than just a visual inspection?
Yes. So if you remember when we discussed this yesterday, the tactic of hiding IEDs in structures and in furniture and as part of the fabric of a building, it required exhaustive checks so that you had a positive confirmation that your assessment was that that building, that room, was clear of any IEDs.
So presumably not only a very dangerous exercise, but also an exercise of significant pressure on those conducting the search.
Yes.
And that perhaps feeds back into what you told us about the effect of the increased use of IEDs upon the morale of the fighting force, and particularly the UK Armed Forces.
Yes.
Not only is there the risk of an explosion at any moment which might kill or maim, but it carries with it the fear throughout the operation that there is that risk.
Yes, absolutely.
Insofar as there were any recognised enemy TTPs, and could we just, if we wouldn't mind, look back to the screen for a moment and very briefly to consider the next slide. Within the OPTAG advisory document, so the Operational Training and Advisory Group Memoir on Compound Clearance, it identified within the enemy TTPs as at December 2011 the following methods favoured by insurgents: small arms fire, RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and then HE grenades, high explosive grenades. I've simply highlighted the third simply for this reason, that as you know from the material that's available, the suggested use of grenades appears in a number of the documents. So that's something to bear in mind, that as at December 2011, OPTAG had noted the use of grenades as being one of the methods favoured by the insurgents.
That's correct.
Can we leave that exhibit, please? And
before we do, Mr. Glasey, could I just ask Admiral, we've heard mention of pattern of life. Could you help us with what that really means and how pattern of life was generally established?
Yes, so again, others will be better able to give a more detailed explanation of particularly those people that served in Afghanistan. But by pattern of life, we mean observing an area and trying to understand how does that area work, organize itself, what is normal, what might be less normal or abnormal, and that can involve everything from talking to your partner forces, observing, having a cultural awareness of the area. Part of this process of liaison with the people that are responsible for an area and then the changeover of deployments so that you don't lose the information as you have those changeover of personnel that have been serving in an area. So it's just trying to understand what is normal and what is abnormal, what is normal so that you can better understand what is normal and you can also better understand what is unusual or abnormal.
In the particular compound?
It is in the particular, in this instance, it's in the particular compound, but it's much wider than that. And it would apply, to be honest, in terms of all our operations. We want to establish what is the pattern of life, and then you are operating in an area and you're applying your military force or your military judgment and capabilities in a way that can be more effective.
Thank you.
And just to pick up on that, Admiral, obviously I'm asking questions about compound clearance for a particular reason, but no one should think that the care that's taken in the approach to those doesn't apply to other operations that the armed forces carried out. And indeed, no one should think that the fundamental principles of the law of armed conflict that I've taken you to don't apply to all activity of the UK Armed Forces.
That's correct.
In the course of dealing with the compound clearance, one of the things that with your help we'd identified at the outset was not only seeking the assistance and acquiescence of an elder to help with the compound search, but also, where possible, that it should be led by the Afghan partner forces. And you touch on the relationship between the UK and the ANDSF a little later in your statement. Can I ask you please to turn briefly to your paragraph 221?
Yes.
We'd considered with your help yesterday the transition period that was to take place, which would in effect see the role that the UK forces played lessen and become more of an advisory role, so that, as was deemed appropriate by President Karzai, there could be a handover from coalition forces to the Afghan forces by the end of 2014.
That's correct.
And what we'd done is we'd looked at some of that with you, but now since we've turned to consider the compound clearance and the role that the ANDSF and other partner forces might play within that, can you help us please with the different approaches that were taken between the partnering and then the mentoring role that there was between UK and ANDSF forces?
Yes. So from May 2008, the start of what we called Operation Herrick 8, until April 2012, the start of Operation Herrick 12, certain UK forces were specifically tasked with the mentoring of the ANDSF. These mentoring teams were known as Observer Mentoring Liaison Teams, or OMLTs, but more colloquially known as omelettes. And the focus of the omelettes was primarily on the ANA, the Afghan National Army, rather than the Afghan National Police.
And insofar as the practice of mentoring is concerned, did that involve assisting them in the planning of operations and then accompanying them on operations in order to give tactical guidance?
That's correct.
You've just dealt with the time frame that took us up until April of 2012 between Op Herrick 8 and 12. From Op Herrick 12 onwards, did the model differ?
Yes. So in line with wider ISAF direction, each of the UK ground holding units at battle group and company level was then partnered with an Afghan National Army counterpart and shared common forward operating bases. So that was a slight adjustment.
And did that ultimately lead to the battle groups then being renamed as a combined force?
That's correct.
So a recognition of the dual role that there then was between the ANA counterpart and the coalition force?
Yes, and that also happened at a higher level. So Task Force Helmand was also partnered with its Afghan National Army counterpart, the headquarters of the 3rd Brigade of 215 Corps, as we described yesterday.
And I'm not going to take you back to that because we'll all be familiar with what you told us. In terms of the partnership model itself, who was primarily responsible for planning, commanding and controlling the partnered operations?
So at this time, it was still with ISAF forces. So they were responsible for the planning, commanding and controlling of partnered operations with the Afghan National Army.
And as there was the shift from pre-op 12, op-Herrick 12 and then after, was the idea that ultimately the Afghan National Army would be more involved in the planning and there'd be a more observing role from the ISAF forces?
That's right. So the much more involvement in the planning, and that was part of the training and the growing of their capability.
In effect, a relatively simple model, and I don't mean that in a discourteous manner, but one that everyone will be familiar with, where you take somebody that you need to teach. Initially, you are giving advice, and they are learning directly from the way you do something, but ultimately their responsibility becomes greater until they are, in effect, carrying out the task themselves with you as an observer.
Yes, and you then are in that slightly stepped back role with them far more in the lead.
As far as the Afghan National Police are concerned, was there a similar approach to them? So a mentoring company, which then saw the ANP having a greater role in the planning and execution of the operations that they were involved with?
That's correct.
And if it's appropriate to try to use ISAF terminology, particularly from the ISAF strategy, was there a switch then from partnership to mentoring?
Yes. And Operation Herrick 12 saw the formal separation of mentoring responsibilities for the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police by the first deployment of a designated subunit as the Police Development Advisory Training Team.
And as you told us yesterday, ultimately the position that is reached sees the UK forces mentoring and giving advice, but only small teams being embedded with the partner forces so that they can act as a quick reaction force to help if needed.
That's right.
And just taking us slightly beyond the relevant period with which the inquiry is concerned, but simply for completeness, in terms of the transition that there was to ultimately Afghan-led operations, from 2015 onwards, was there a new NATO mission that began?
Yes, so that's the one that was called Operation Resolute Support. And this phase of the NATO operation was conceptually different and involved a train, advise and assist mission delivered through what we call a hub and spoke model, centred in Kabul, with regional headquarters delivering the mission in the north, east, west and south of the country.
So ultimately this being the culmination of a long plan to put the Afghan government, the Afghan military and the Afghan police in the best possible position to run their own country with a democratic government, with the rule of law in place and with effective security for Afghan nationals.
That's correct, and fulfilling President Karzai's directive that we discussed yesterday, for that to be achieved by the end of December 2014.
Now we're going to turn to consider a different chapter of your evidence, and I don't want to confuse you, but I'd like to take things slightly out of sequence. So what I'd like to do first is to deal with command states. So I'm going to take you first, if I may, to paragraph 235. And here you have set out the different command states and the states of command and control, which perhaps will help explain some of the language we're likely to come across during the remainder of the inquiry. And I know that these will be states of command and control with which you are very familiar, but there will be others who come to listen to the evidence who will have less of an understanding of the detail. And it would help me, certainly, and I'm sure others, if you could give us your assistance and your expert knowledge in explaining some of the different degrees of command and control that are recognised by the UK military forces.
Yes.
Insofar as command states are concerned, is that to do with the ability to assign an independent mission, to reorganise a unit, or to direct specific tasks, all within an agreed mission parameter?
That is correct.
And in order to understand how command authority works, is that ultimately a prerequisite for effective cooperation?
It is, and the system that we use in terms of what we deem command and control states is also the same that is used within NATO, and the same approach and definition that we have between the UK approach and that within NATO.
And although, of course, we're focusing in the inquiry on the period mid-2010 to mid-2013, the command and control states you're about to take us through not only applied then, but still apply today.
Yes.
So please could we have your help with the various states of command and control and some of the abbreviations, so we'll know how to recognise them and what they might mean in due course.
Yes. So the first one is what we call full command, or full com, and that's the military authority and responsibility of a commander to issue orders to subordinates. It covers every aspect of military operations and administration and exists only within national services. So the term command, as used internationally, implies a lesser degree of authority than when it is used in a purely national sense. No NATO or coalition commander has full com over other nations' forces assigned to them. And so in this instance, full com is still with the heads of the services of the Army, Navy and Air Force for their people that are in theatre.
And this, of course, plays back to the dual-hatted role that we described between the national component commander and how he sat within ISAF as the deputy commander, but also head of the sovereign forces.
Yes.
So for the avoidance of any doubt, if the use of the term full com or commander is applied to ISAF, it only evolves, well, it doesn't directly relate to full command over any sovereign group of forces.
That's correct.
As to operational command, which I think is broken down to OPCOM, could you help us with that, please?
Yes, so OPCOM is the authority granted to a commander to assign missions or tasks to subordinate commanders, to deploy units and to reassign forces, and to retain or delegate operational and or tactical control as may be deemed necessary. And in this instance, if we said that full com was vested in the heads of the armed forces, for us, the Chief of Joint Operations was the person who tended to have OPCOM for UK forces deployed to Afghanistan.
And then if we leave command for a moment and go to control, we've just dealt with OPCOM. I think we're now going to deal with OPCON, so operational control. Can you help us with that, please?
Yes, this is the authority delegated to a commander to direct forces assigned so that the commander may accomplish specific missions or tasks, which are usually limited by function, time or location, and to deploy units concerned and to retain or assign tactical control to those units. So in this instance, this applies as primarily to ISAF, with having had UK forces deployed to him and for him then to be able to use in the phrase that we've described as OPCON.
So the commander ISAF had OPCON over UK forces, not to be confused with either full com or OPCOM.
That's correct.
And then in terms of tactical command and control, which are steps beneath, can you help us with the two of those, please?
Yes, tactical command, or TACOM, is the authority delegated to a commander to assign tasks to forces under his command for the accomplishment of the mission assigned by a higher authority. So this is when in Afghanistan you're coming down a level from COM ISAF to either COM IJC or to the commander of a regional area, in the UK instance predominantly Regional Command Southwest. And then shall I carry on to tactical control?
Yes, please. So that's TACOM.
TACOM, tactical control, is the detailed and usually local direction and control of movements or manoeuvres necessary to accomplish missions or tasks assigned. So then you're at a very low level of tactical formations.
Before we go any further or confuse anyone anymore, we have the advantage of figure K. And if I can ask that figure K is brought up on the screen, what you'd helpfully done, Admiral, is set out the different authorities that apply and whether they are relevant to OPCOM, OPCON, TACOM or TACON. And we can see here a breakdown in the powers of those who are exercising those different states of command or control, and which power they have and which power they don't have.
Yes.
We can see that we've got on the left-hand side the assigning of separate employment or components of assigned forces, assigning missions, reassigning forces, delegating OPCON, delegating TACON, deploying units, assigning tasks, and then the eighth, direct and control movements or manoeuvres necessary to accomplish the subordinate commander's assigned missions or tasks.
Yes.
And what we can see is helpfully how you've applied a series of crosses to identify which state of command or control has which of those authorities attached to it.
Yes.
Now, I'm sure that's made everything a lot clearer for everyone, but probably making it a little less clear, there are some other delegated positions which permit authority to be exercised, and we're going to deal with administrative control, logistic control, and then coordinating authority and direct liaison authority. And could I help your help with those, please? Because it may be in due course that we'll see those abbreviations appear, and it'll help if we've got a reference to come back to.
Yes, so administrative control, or ADCON, or sometimes AdminCom, is the direction or exercise of authority over subordinate or other organisations in respect of administrative matters. So this is much more to do with personnel management, supply services, and some of those other aspects. Logistic control, or LOGCOM, was the authority granted to a NATO commander over assigned logistics units and organisations in a particular area, including what we call national support elements, that empower the commander to synchronise, prioritise and integrate their logistic functions and their activities to accomplish the joint theatre mission. And then we have a commanding authority, or direct liaison authority, DIRLAW, which is granted to a commander or individual assigned responsibility for coordinating specific functions or activities involving forces of two or more countries or commands, or two or more services, or two or more forces of the same service.
Having dealt with those, and thank you very much for your help, could I ask for your assistance on the philosophy of mission command as exercised in the British Armed Forces and its application in the Afghanistan theatre? And for reference, I'm going to ask you to look at your paragraph 237, please, Admiral.
Yes.
In terms of mission command and what it means, can you help us with an explanation of that particular philosophy of command?
Yes, so this is something that is adopted across the whole of the UK's armed forces, and it's a philosophy of command that promotes freedom of action and initiative. So mission command focuses on outcomes as it stresses the importance of understanding what effect is to be achieved rather than specifying the ways in which it should be achieved. So it's about your subordinates understanding what you want them to achieve, not about how they're going to do it. And it gives them a bit more freedom to focus on the how, and that they understand very, very clearly the what.
Is the purpose behind it that if you encourage your subordinates to understand the end game or the end state, that they're better able to prepare for it and to go about the mission?
Yes, we want them to understand the commander's intent, and that's the crucial aspect. And then we use their expertise to achieve that intent and give them some freedom on how it's done.
So rather than simply directing somebody to do a particular task in a prescribed manner, it enables them to think for themselves and to make their own decisions, providing they are appropriate to achieving the mission, and providing, of course, they're within the bounds of the rules of engagement and they recognise and adhere to the law of armed conflict.
Yes.
And in terms of the key elements of mission command, could you just take us through those elements so that we're able to understand and recognise the process that is applied by a commander when he or she requires service personnel to carry out any particular action, and how they then decide how best to go about it?
Yes, so a commander gives their orders in a manner that ensures that their subordinates understand the commander's intent and the missions given to each of the subordinates and the context of those missions. Then that subordinates are told what effect they are to achieve and the reason why it is required. Subordinates are allocated sufficient resources to carry out their missions, and a commander uses the minimum level of control possible so as to not unnecessarily constrain their subordinates' freedom of action, and subordinates decide how best to achieve their missions. They have a fundamental responsibility to act in line with their commander's intent.
So if we look at it on a very simple level, the what and the why are explained, but the how is left to the subordinates to plan themselves, subject, of course, to understanding the intent and operating proportionately, legally, and in accordance with all appropriate rules.
Yes, and just so as to make it clear, that you don't have then absolute freedom. You're expected to follow the guidance and the training that you've also had. So it's combining that with those fundamentals that you mentioned in terms of the law of armed conflict as well.
And so can I take you back then in your statement to deal with fighting power, because it's perhaps an appropriate moment to consider what the British Army identifies as fighting power and the standards and the values that are expected to be adhered to by every member of the armed forces, whether they are conventional forces or special forces.
Yes.
In terms of fighting power, if I take you back to paragraph 232 of your statement, is fighting power what provides the British Army with its ability to operate and to fight and to engage in combat?
That's correct, and we describe it as having three components. The conceptual component, which is the ideas behind how to operate and fight. The moral component, the ability to get people to operate and fight. And then the physical component, which is the means to operate and fight. And it's about combining all three components to have an effective fighting force.
In terms of understanding what it is you've just set out with the conceptual, moral and physical component, can I just ask that we look at your figure J together on the screen? And what you've set out here is how those three components overlap with each other and how they bring with them ethical, moral and physical skills, all of which are intended to contribute to fighting power and to put the individual servicemen and women and the collective UK Armed Forces in the best position to operate, to fight and to engage in combat.
That's correct.
And we can see, if we look at them, that the conceptual component is broken down with the understanding of conflict and context, the higher level doctrine, philosophy and principles, the lower level doctrine, practices and procedures, and then education, innovation and lessons.
Yes.
So that conceptual component carries with it not only the pre-deployment training and the deployment training that we've spoken about, that which was delivered by OPTAG, but also an understanding of the fundamental principles upon which the law of armed conflict is based, how those need to be borne in mind, and how practice needs to adhere to the philosophy and the law behind armed conflict.
That's correct.
If we go in a clockwise direction, and having started with concept, perhaps it's appropriate then to move into the moral component, because clearly the two bleed one into the other. But we can see that for the moral component, what you've identified is motivation, moral cohesion, and ethical foundation. And all of those are fundamental values that you would expect anyone under your command to adhere to.
Yes.
And then we can see, as we work round, the physical component, which is the third of the three components to fighting power, and that comprises capability development, sustainability, training, equipment, and manpower.
Yes.
And all of those combine to make the physical component part of both the conceptual and the moral, which combine to make what you have termed and the armed forces describe as fighting power.
Yes.
Can I just have your help, please, with some of the exhibits that you have helpfully provided to us? And what I'd like to do is to take you to your AR20. AR20 we looked at yesterday, which is the Army Doctrine publication on operations. What I'd like to do, please, Admiral, is just look on 2 slides, please, to a section that's headed Values and Standards. And it will come as no surprise that the Army has codified 6 different values which it regards as fundamental to the members of British Armed Forces.
Yes.
And again, whilst very clearly you've given your evidence in respect of conventional forces, the values that we're about to look at and the standards we'll consider apply to conventional and special forces alike.
That's correct.
They are fundamental standards and values that are expected of all servicemen and women, no matter what role they perform.
Yes.
Could we just turn over the page, please, and just to look together the moral qualities of each individual soldier in his or her social behaviour have a pragmatic and functional utility because they provide the essence of operational effectiveness. And we can see here how the British Army has linked operational effectiveness to moral quality.
That's correct.
And that is a significant link that each of the 3 services draws.
Yes.
Upholding values to the required standards is the collective responsibility of the Army and all its units, and they form the foundations of teamwork which multiplies the fighting power of each individual.
That's correct.
So the individual standards of each serviceman and woman contributes to the whole to make the whole more effective.
Yes.
So where one person lets down the standards of values, it leads to a weakness in the overall whole.
Yes, potentially.
Now, the values that are identified are set out next. Selfless commitment, soldiers accept a commitment to serve wherever and whenever they are needed, whatever the difficulties and dangers.
That is correct.
Courage is identified as the next value. All soldiers should be prepared for tasks that involve the use of controlled lethal force, and you told us about that yesterday.
Yes.
If we look over the page, moral courage is arguably even more important. So not simply the courage to use lethal force, but the moral courage to do what is right. And that is a fundamental value that is expected of all UK servicemen and women.
Yes, and it's emphasised in those three components of fighting power. The one that is given the most emphasis is the moral component. You have to have that in order to be effective in fighting.
And what we see set out here is not simply the courage to do what is right, but the courage to do what is right even if it is unpopular or appears to be the most uncertain course. This is also the courage to insist on maintaining high standards.
Yes.
Next is discipline. Discipline is the glue that binds soldiers together when threatened.
Yes.
Over the page and onto the next slide, we have integrity. Individual needs are subordinated to collective effectiveness. So the importance of personal integrity and a preparedness to engage in combat by choice, but obviously when directed so to do.
That's correct.
And then loyalty. Loyalty should flow up and down a hierarchy and can transform individuals into teams.
Yes.
So an expectation that both the subordinates and the commanders will be loyal to each other.
Yes, it very much works both ways.
And it's that cohesive strength which binds a force together and makes it more effective.
Yes.
And over the slide, please. Behaviour that undermines the reputation of the team, the unit, the army and the nation is an act of disloyalty and a breach of trust.
Yes.
So a recognition within this fundamental set of principles that where anyone engages in behaviour that undermines the reputation simply of the team, that is regarded as an act of disloyalty.
Yes.
And then respect for others. That means treating others as you expect to be treated yourself. On operations, it provides moral guidance to underpin the laws of conflict, ensuring that human rights are respected and behaviour in battle is honourable at all times. An army elevates itself above others, not just by its ability to prevail, but by the methods it uses to prevail.
Yes.
The significance, of course, there being it's not just the winning that counts, but it's how you go about securing success.
That's correct.
It's about the way your armed forces uphold the standards and values expected of them, that they behave legally, and that they behave morally and ethically in an appropriate manner.
Yes.
And all of that you would expect of each serviceman and woman beneath your command.
Yes.
Can we turn on to consider the standards that are expected? Because we've dealt with values and the fundamental values that are set out. The standards can be found on the next slide, please. The service test is the device used to measure behaviour in order to set standards. And the three standards expected require lawful, appropriate, and totally professional behaviour at all times.
Yes.
So echoing what you just told us, that the expectation you would have of anyone under your command is that at all times they behave within the confines of the law, in a manner that is appropriate and that they are totally professional.
Yes.
Because each serviceman and woman is representative of the British Armed Forces, both the unit, the regiment, the wider battalion and the armed forces as a whole.
Yes.
And ultimately they're representatives of the nation.
That's correct.
Because we are judged by the way in which our armed forces behave.
Yes.
Which is why these values are set out in such detail and why they are taught to every member of the British Armed Forces.
That's correct.
Clearly, in terms of how the armed forces structures and manages itself, leadership is a fundamental core of how the armed forces operates.
Yes.
Can I just take you in another of your exhibits, please, to AR6? What I'd like to do within the body of that document will identify first that it's one of the two documents I asked you about yesterday, namely how defence works. If we go, I think it'll be the fourth slide, if you wouldn't mind. The new defence operating model, so one slide on, I can't count, thank you. The defence vision. The defence vision sets out how we will continue to protect our country and help to project its values and interests abroad by delivering battle-winning armed forces, a smaller, more professional Ministry of Defence, and a hard-headed approach to what we can afford. This must be underpinned by strong leadership at every level. So this isn't simply leadership from the top, those that have full com or full con. This is leadership throughout the services, recognising that anyone who has a position of authority above a subordinate should have strong leadership and appropriate values.
That's correct.
And if we just look over the page in the next slide, under people, behaviours and business improvement, leadership at every level of defence, making the right decisions at the right time for the right reasons and learning from the things that go wrong. That is what being a leader is all about.
Yes.
The allegations with which this inquiry is concerned strike at the very heart of the values and standards we've just been through.
Yes.
And of course it falls to this inquiry to determine whether there is credible evidence to support any of those allegations.
That's correct.
And in doing so, we will need to look not only to the law, but also to the standards and the values that the British Army has set and expects of its fighting men and women.
That's correct.
Admiral, thank you for the help that you have given us, and particularly me, over the last day or so. I'm conscious that I've done a lot of asking of questions, and you've very kindly answered them. What I haven't done is given you the courtesy of asking you whether there is anything that you would like to say that isn't set out within your statement, because your statement was a direct answer to a series of questions, and for that we're extremely grateful. But I have no doubt that in your position as Chief of the Defence Staff, that there is something that you will want to say to this inquiry, and particularly to the Chair, about the progress that we might make and the support that we hope to have from you.
Yes, well, thank you. And particularly for the Chair, I'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate the Ministry of Defence's support for this inquiry. We recognise that this inquiry is focused on the conduct of deliberate detention operations within a very specific 3-year period and the subsequent response by the Ministry of Defence. It should not take away from the effort and commitment of the many thousands of British personnel who were deployed to Afghanistan over a period of more than 2 decades, and who, as we learned yesterday, risked their lives, and many of whom lost their lives and also suffered injuries. But we're also very clear that this involves justifying our reputation and to maintain public confidence now and for the future. And it's right that allegations of unlawful activity are thoroughly investigated. And it is right that we look at the MOD's response to consider whether further lessons need to be learned. That is why the government established this independent inquiry, and it's why the inquiry has the full support of both me and the Permanent Secretary, and also the full support of the service chiefs. We acknowledge that this will be an emotive and uncomfortable process for some, but the MOD is committed to supporting our people throughout this undertaking. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our servicemen and women for their understanding and their cooperation, and I'm grateful to them for their support to this inquiry. Thank you.
Admiral, thank you for that, and thank you for coming to give your evidence. A great deal of useful ground has been covered, and I'm grateful to all the work that has been put into that and the exhibits. That concludes, I think, your evidence, and that concludes the proceedings for today.
So yes, it does. Tomorrow we're going to move to consider a different chapter of evidence, and with the assistance of Miss Broom and Mr Polnay, we're going to be turning to the legal principles that are relevant to this inquiry and those which applied and still apply to the operation of the British Armed Forces.
Good. Thank you. Well, we'll adjourn now until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please. And I wish everybody a good day. Thank you.